Welcome to Seeing the World Through Rosé-Colored Glasses, featuring all integrated brands and produced by the Wine Education Department. At the Wine Education Department, we inspire, equip, and empower you to be the best professional you can be. All right, after this presentation, our hope is that you will have gained some insight as a group as to the way these wines fit into your marketplace and with your clients and your accounts. Perhaps you'll have gained some insight from fellow salespeople as to how they're approaching the market with these wines, secrets that have started to work for them. Anything that will help us continue to lead the charge for these wines is going to be a super positive add. And hopefully some of the facts that we pass along will add to that story that you can tell. And because, great stories sell wine as much as anything else these days. So rosé, world over, rosé-colored glasses. We can see the world through this kind of light of pink wine, and it's really cool because, there wasn't that long ago that pink wine was extremely challenging to sell. Even in my own career, the first time I tried to focus in on dry rosé, the battle was uphill based on perception and the history of pink wine in the marketplace in which I was working. But, pink wine, rosé wine, is actually a lot longer history than we might imagine otherwise. It actually goes back into ancient times when people really actually kind of preferred lighter colored wines to begin with, when red and white grapes were often blended together as a field blend to make wines, and so the color wasn't nearly as dark as what we would see today. The Romans most assuredly preferred lighter colored wines. It's fairly well documented. And when the Phoenicians in the 6th century BCE founded Massalia, which we now know of as Marseille, they planted grapes and they made a wine that is sort of the core beginnings of what we know as the rosé culture today. It was also very common to water down your wine in antiquity. One, to, I suppose, be able to get more water into your body without getting sick from the contaminants in the water supply. And two, to be able to drink more wine without worrying about its effects. It was actually considered barbaric to drink full-strength wine, and that the bad things that people did were often associated with drinking it without watering it down. A very fascinating cultural influence. Whatever it takes to get us to where we are today. The next sort of boon in that regard was when we make it into the world of Bordeaux, and in those wines we're talking about wines that were defined as claret, and it was sort of the expected social norm of great wine to be from Bordeaux and to be called claret. And these were sort of dark rosé, light-colored red wines at the time, primarily based on grapes like Merlot, which dominated the plantings in the 18th and 19th century of all Bordeaux. And so even the British marketplace, who dominated the purchasing of these wines, were more inspired by wines of lighter color than they were of dark. And so then we move into the south of France and the inspiration that happened as people started to wander down to the Côte d'Azur for vacations and to wander around in the sun and swim and have a great time on the Mediterranean coast, and then come in thirsty and warm and sit down to a bottle of dry rosé. And it became what then for that region was an everyday wine. Became all of a sudden the chic wine. Oh yes, I went to the Côte d'Azur and I played on the beach and I drank rosé and life was fantastic. And that influence brought us to the next step in history, where after World War II, we end up in the world of rosé is now known. But the American palate especially prefers things that have some sugar in it. We had started down the path of cocktails, we had started down the path of Coca-Cola, and it was certainly easier to get people to like blush style wines. That would be rosé with residual sugar. And 2 wines from Portugal started dominating the scene. One was Matus Rosé, and the other was Lancers. And that was sort of the groovy thing that happened over the course of the 70s and 60s especially. That became super popular, and it was kind of the thing. And then late in the 1970s, we find that we came up with our own idea that helped promote wine consumption, but not necessarily dry rosé. And I do want to be careful here that we not put these wines down as that they were a bad thing, because to be quite honest, without a lot of people learning to drink Lancers and Matus and even White Zinfandel, those same people then progressed to the other wines we're selling today. So they were a gateway from soda pop and iced tea and coffee into the world of wine. So in some ways we have to be a little grateful. And then we move into the idea of Sutter Home. And Sutter Home most assuredly started to change the face of wine in America through their creation of White Zinfandel. At first, White Zinfandel was actually a dry rosé made by Sutter Home, and one fateful event happened and the fermentation stuck, and they chose to sell it with the residual sugar, and it was far more popular and started flying off the shelves, and a star was born, so to speak. It was already a style of wine that a great majority of Americans really enjoyed. This was the same time frame that the most popular wines on the shelf were still dominated by things like Black Tower and Liebfraumilch Milk and Lancers and Matus. So it was a natural fit, and honestly, right up until the time that this would have been in the late 1990s in Michigan, I was still selling, at least a 15-pack of White Zinfandel in my restaurant by the glass every week. So this is not like that culture went away. And we know that today, based on what we see with Prosecco and what we see with some wines that say they're dry but actually aren't, that the love of sweetness in beverages is, one, there's nothing wrong with it, and two, it still exists. So there's no reason that off-dry rosé should have to go away, but it does cloud the possibilities and the next generation of option, which would be moving to dry rosés. And so even today, after all this time, fortifying what I just said, Sutter Home White Zinfandel sells 2 million 9-liter cases per year. So that it's still heavily consumed. So in the 21st century and moving forward, we get to the point where we're now going to talk about getting back to the idea of rosé by intention, more importantly, dry rosé by intention, getting back to the sort of Southern French model that has become very popular, down to the point that we often see that if it's too darkly colored pink, people won't buy it because they assume that it's not a wine they'll like, even though rosé should come in all kinds of colors. And we're going to look at this through the eyes of all of our import companies, Craft and Estate, LLS, Mondovino, and Negociants. They all have really delicious, beautiful rosés that we can take to the market, each of which can have its own sort of individual place, depending on the retailer or the restaurant, and we can certainly compete heavily in this market. Let's talk about the winemaking methods to make rosés to get started, because sometimes rosé can be an accident, I suppose, but these wines are intentional. So the first way to make rosé is by maceration. So you're growing grapes that you're intentionally planning to turn into rosé. So you're harvesting them and treating the vineyard sources in a way to produce red grapes that give you the coloring level you want, the fruit you want, and the end-all be-all acidity base you want, so that you're making a refreshing style of wine from red grapes. In that process, you're crushing the grapes, you're putting them in a fermentation tank, you're macerating them at some level for a certain amount of time, just to get the color you're looking for. If it's Provence-style rosé, that's a very short maceration. If it's a little darker color rosé, maybe it's a little longer. It moves from there off the skins into the fermentation tank, and from there, it's a fairly fast process. Ferment it, get it stable, clarify it, get it in the bottle, and sell it young and fresh. The Saignée method, or the bleed-off method, starts in the process of making red wine. So you've managed your vineyards and you've managed your process to make this sources of this vineyards are intended to go into a bottle that's got red wine in it. So you put the grapes into the vat, they're macerating, and you're like, okay, I'd like my grape juice to be a little deeper color. So you bleed off some of the initial wine that has been lightly colored into another fermentation tank, which allows there to be a larger portion of skin to juice ratio. So now you have less juice and a lot more skins to macerate. You therefore have your anthocyanins being pulled out of the grapes, not diluted as much. You get darker wine, which is really helpful if you're dealing with grapes that don't have a ton of color, or you're dealing with grapes or you're trying to make a style of wine that's deeply colored because of the way the market reacts to it. For instance, deepening the color of Cabernet Sauvignon out of California by doing a bleed off instead of adding mega purple. From there, it's the same thing. Ferment, clarify, filter, in the bottle, and off you go. The difference is that this process develops two wines, rosé and red. Then there's direct pressing. All right, so now you're directly pressing. The pressing itself extracts some of the color, and you put it straight in a fermentation tank. If you're doing heavily colored grapes, like say Malbec, where the anthocyanins are rich, you crush it and the juice runs through, it gets lightly stained, and into the fermentation vat it goes. That is a way to make sure that you get pale colored juice out of deeply colored grapes, or if you're just really looking for the palest of rosés, you could do that with even grapes that don't have a ton of color. And last but not least, you have the blending of wine. Very common in the world of making sparkling wine. You actually have red wine that you've made, you have white wine that you've made, and you're putting them together after fermentation, but before you're putting them in the bottle, and you're letting them blend together in an aging process. In the case of champagne, that is either going to happen where you take the red wine and the white wine and you blend it together and then do the second fermentation in the bottle. And then the other option is to add red wine to the dosage so that it tints the wine at the very end. Those are both options in sparkling wine. Obviously, if you're making just a traditional still rosé, you would blend them together and then let them age a little while to harmonize and then bottle. So we're going to start with the Negociants wines. Negociants is a fabulous partner with us, really bringing some great wines from Australia, South Africa, New Zealand, and the island of Tasmania. Lots and lots of history involved in when you start to combine all these things, and if you haven't been exploring their portfolio, you definitely should. There's some real stars here. We're going to start with sparkling wine. Speaking of, this is a 78% Pinot Noir and 22% Chardonnay. It does go through 100% malolactic fermentation. It is considered, well, traditional method is not exactly. This is actually called Méthode Tasman. And because it's a modification of classical sparkling wine methodologies. But let's start with where it's sourced. The source of the grapes is kind of all across Tasmania, but it definitely includes Piper's River in the north and Tamar Valley, and then Coal River in the south. Tasmania, because of its climate, being below 40 degrees, well, above 40 degrees south, which means higher latitude, even though it's kind of an oxymoronic way to say it, in the middle of the roaring 40s, definitely a cooler climate than what a lot of people thought was possible to grow grapes. What we have found now through experimentation, through dedication, is this is a great place to grow Pinot Noir and Chardonnay, especially a great place to make sparkling wine, which was the first reason people explored planting grapes in Tasmania anyway. So this is a mix of classical sparkling wine techniques, and what they actually do is sort of combine the methodology of Charmat method and traditional method. And what I mean by that is for this particular group of wines, you are basically employing Charmat method fermentation. So the second fermentation is happening in a tank under pressure. The difference is that they are extending the lees contact inside that tank, sort of like we would do if we were doing the lees contact in the bottle from which we are drinking. That achieves a similar result. You still get the lees flavor, you still get that autolytic degradation that happens that makes champagne special. The difference is that you have less expense, and it's a little faster when you're ready to get to the final product, because you filter and bottle under pressure, and boom, out the door, great Jansz Rosé goes. Definitely want to pay attention here to just the general idea of this wine. When you start talking about the qualities that turn into great sparkling wine, one of the things that you're looking at is pH and overall ripeness. And what I think is wonderful about these wines is this wine carries a pH of 3.1, which is not very far from the concept of what the pH would be out of a wine in Champagne. And it has a 12% alcohol content, which is very similar to Champagne. This is what I consider to be a really great value-driven quality bottle of sparkling wine. For those of you who have to have the grams per liter, they keep this at 8.2. And having had a discussion about it with the Negociants folks, this is what Australia really likes. They like that slightly, just a few more or a couple more grams of residual sugar. That's what they're looking for in their sparkling wine, and so that's why this wine is what it is. So jump in there, taste it, hit pause, talk about it with your friends that are here watching it with you, and come back to the next slide. The next one from the Negociants portfolio is the Tournon Mathilda Rosé. And this is 100% Grenache. In this particular case, they're destemming them and gently pressing them. This is made in a southern extension of the Great Dividing Range in the Pyrenees foothills of Victoria. It has all kinds of different microclimates in the foothills, as you would think, right? Because when you deal with elevation and mountains, you have little nooks and crannies throughout the hillsides and different exposures and elevations and everything else. This is a very low cropping, and it's a tribute to Michel Chapoutier's daughter Mathilda, and the unofficial Australian national anthem of Waltzing Matilda. The idea here is that we're going to make sort of southern French dry rosé out of a classically southern French grape variety, but we're just going to make it in Australia and take advantage of the mountainous terrain and the microclimates that are available to us. This wine is wonderfully refreshing, and I think that you'll find that it does remind you of European rosé. I mean, when you start looking at the analytical data, it's 13.3% alcohol, 3.1 on the pH, and so super friendly, very similar to what you would get when you order from Europe. So Craft and Estate is our next option. We're obviously very proud of this arm of our portfolio and their imports. They're doing a great job of finding really great small artisan as well as larger producers, and this will be no exception as we move into their wines for this section. So our next wine is Figuière Magali Rosé, and this is absolutely classic, spot-on Côte de Provence style rosé. Figuière is located in La Landon de Maure, between Marseille and Nice. You know, the vineyards lie just a few hundred meters from the Mediterranean Sea, and the other uniqueness about the vineyards here is that they're actually on schist, which is not the most common soil when you're in that area, and definitely influences the wines in a really unique way. The Combard family has been at this for like 25 years, and they have a fairly large estate in excess of 210 acres. This is a blend traditionally of Cinsault, Cabernet, Syrah, and Grenache. The blend changes year in, year out, so you always want to take a look at the back of the bottle. It is that classic intentionally made rosé from the vineyard all the way to the wine, and maceration is the technique. They just do it in a very short amount of time, see 2 to 3 hours, which is totally fine when you're dealing with these grapes because other than Syrah, not a lot of anthocyanins are going to be lent from this particular growing methodology. When you look at the makeup of the wine, you're dealing with 3.4 pH, so it's certainly not razor's edge tartness, but it's that pleasant, refreshing level of tartness. It's 13% alcohol. It only has 1 gram of sugar, and that's probably just by unfermentable sugar at the end. So very refreshing, very crisp. Take a taste of it. Remind yourself how delicious this wine is. Hit pause, and we'll come back to the next wine in just a moment. All right, now we're moving to Greece. GAIA 14 to 18 hour rosé. It's pronounced GAIA. This is made from 100% Aioritico. That's Aioritico. It's named after their initial intention, which was to macerate the grapes for 14 to 18 hours at a temperature control, kind of a cold soak concept to extract a color, and come up with a wine that was a little darker in color than the other rosés on the shelf, offer a little more fruit, offer just a little bit of tannin, and be something different. And they still hold to that mantra, but you should not assume that it's always 14 to 18 hours, because it's become more of a brand moniker than an absolute have to do this. So this was this winery, GAIA, was founded in 1994, and the mission of this winery was to capture the best of Greece's indigenous grape varieties while meeting the modern world where it wanted to be met. And so they are doing a great job with using technology and vineyard management and a philosophy that makes their wines inherently lovable. Very high quality, very well balanced, and yet very true to the individual grape variety. And that's really all we could ever ask from any wine region that's trying to stick with something other than what everybody else is growing, is that they would do it to the best of their ability. So the grapes for this actually come and are from vineyards located on the higher elevations of Nemea, which is great because rosé is one of the targets for those higher elevations to begin with, or at least very lightly colored and refreshing reds. And so the mountainous sections of Nemea of Kutsi and Asprocampos are where you'll get these vineyards, and they are grown at that general elevation of 2,600 plus feet, which surprisingly changes the microclimate of that vineyard. It's really interesting to be in Greece and start down in the valley and then start climbing up the hill either by car or whatever, and you get up to the top and there's this amazingly refreshing breeze. It was hot and stifling down in the valley, and it can be a significant temperature change, and it's definitely a big deal in the spring and the fall where you're dealing with more moderate temperatures to begin with. The idea is to macerate them at a chilled temperature, in this case about 50 degrees Fahrenheit, and then get that superb rosy hue out of it. And the time, as I mentioned, is going to be dictated on each year. It's not actually always 14 to 18 hours. All right, so again, technical data on this, 13% alcohol, 3.2 pH. One of the things I love about Greek wines is that the pH nearly across the board is less than you would ever expect for what is considered a Mediterranean climate. And the wine's pretty dry, so it's 1.7 grams per liter. All right, taste this wine, talk amongst yourselves, and hopefully you'll talk about how much you love it and where you can place it in the marketplace. We're now moving into LLS, and we're all super familiar with the extreme quality that we get out of LLS, the massive diversity, how well they cover the Italian peninsula, the longevity that comes from their legacy of being basically Winebow before we were all Winebow. And it's always great to represent their wines. Let's talk about what we got going with their wines. So we're going to start their wines with the Pico Macario Lavignone Rosato. This is 100% Barbera. It's fermented in stainless steel. They do a little short skin contact followed by a separate sort of cold soak and then separate fermentation. So the Macario brothers believe that it's all about having clean, healthy Barbera fruit if you're going to turn it into anything, but especially a rosé, and that the character of the fruit should always be the loudest voice. I think you'll probably find that this wine really represents that this pale color it has this zippy sort of zesty feel from the Barbera, and certainly very pleasurable. So the specifics on the wine, it's 12.5% alcohol. It's 3.3 pH, so pretty tart. and the residual sugar ends up at 3.8. So that's really quite balanced. The wine is easily likable. I've served this to a few people myself and their thoughts were very, very positive. So give it a taste, hit pause, and come back in just a moment for the next wine. So now we're on to the Tasca d'Almerita Regaleali Le Rosé. It's 100% Nerello Mascalese. You do a cold soak for 12 hours to extract the color. Nerello Mascalese is a thin-skinned red grape variety, so it doesn't offer a lot of color, so the 12 hours is kind of necessary. And then, of course, we're moving into temperature-controlled stainless steel. This is sort of an homage to the thousands of roses that are brought in from all over the world and planted on this estate. And that's sort of where the name comes from, but the quality of this wine and the noted nature of this wine is really all about Nerello Mascalese, which is now the heroic grape of Mount Etna and the Etna DOC, and turning it into rosé is a great idea, and it really does well in this format. What you're going to find here is a wine that is 13% alcohol, really perfect for refreshing rosé, a 3.3 pH and 2.7 grams per liter. So fruit forward, zippy, a little bit of cut from the acidity, and that really sort of bright red fruit character that you get out of Nerello Mascalese that sort of reminds you a little bit of a Pinot Noir rosé, but at the same time has that sort of specifically Sicilian feel to it. So give this a taste and hit pause, and we'll come back and we'll be talking about our Mondovino friends. So Mondovino, we know as all those Latin countries and both South America as well as the Iberian Peninsula. And we're actually it's so awesome to have a portfolio that is this broad and can meet the marketplace everywhere from stackable to collectible. What we have now is this Lapostolle Le Rosé. How could they not have a rosé? They're essentially a French family in Chile. It is a very pale rosé by tradition. They like the idea of the southern French Côte de Provence style of just barely pink. It's a free-run juice, so they're crushing the grapes and letting the juice run out with whatever coloring it comes with, and that's how it's going to be pink or not. They use a very sort of traditional Southern Rhone style blend of Cinsault, Syrah, Grenache, and Mourvedre, and sort of bringing them back to their original culture. It exhibits. The vineyard is a semi-arid Mediterranean climate with, they only have rainfall really in the winter. The cool influence from Pacific's Humboldt Current leaks into the valley and cools it off more than you might think for the area. They take this and they are going to keep it in a cool fermentation so that it maintains the fruits and doesn't let it get too far away, 14 to 16 degrees Celsius. And then it's aged 3 months in tanks and released. I just tasted the 18 yesterday, and it is bright and juicy and delicious. And I'm excited for all of you to be able to show this to your markets and really kind of turn heads with, wait a minute, this is Chilean rosé? Really? Yes, it's Chilean rosé as seen through the eyes of an inherently French family. So give it a taste, collect your thoughts together, hit pause before you move on, because we're going to move to Portugal after this. All right, so we're on to João Portugal Ramos Vinho Verde Rosé. This is so much fun. It's got a great package. It's interesting grape varieties. It's 50% Touriga Nacional, 30% Pereiro, and 20% Esperero. The final two are local varieties there in Vinho Verde. And Touriga Nacional is the pride and joy of the entire country. This one's made by a short maceration, and then of course stainless steel fermentation, as all the others were. All right, so the grapes are actually coming from the regions of Lima and Cavado in the Vinho Verde region, and their intention here is as it should be, and that is to produce a fresh, vibrant rosé, and it's pretty straightforward that they've achieved it completely. It's a very delicious, everyday drinking, refreshing style of rosé that I believe just about anyone who likes dry pink wine is going to get into. So give it a taste. Think about all the applications of a wine that tastes like this at this price point can have in your marketplace. Hit pause. So key points to take away. This is the season to sell rosé, but I know I personally drink rosé all year. I think there is most certainly a marketplace for rosé all year now, as people have learned to love it in their by the glass programs in restaurants, or even just because they like the idea of summer when it's not summer and they drink it at home. Certainly we're going to concentrate on it like crazy for the next couple of months, but don't let it slip off the radar in November or even January or February, where you can revive some people's thoughts of the summer and spring that they missed. It's made in all different kinds of styles. You should not allow the market to tell you that the only real dry rosé is that pale Provence style, because there's way more options available than that, and certainly all of them are legitimate. Note that the method of production is going to sort of dictate that style. Are you doing Saignée method? Are you doing intentional maceration? Did you grow these grapes specifically for rosé? Or are you using a red wine vineyard and taking some of it for rosé? All these things matter in the final product. There's a lot of competition out there, but there's also a lot of attention for rosé, and our wines are really strong contenders in various price points that I think will play really well for all of you. Thank you very much. Have a great rest of your day.